Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world without Netflix, without scrolling TikTok at 2 in the morning, and definitely without the cozy mattress you're probably lying on right now. You might think your bed is uncomfortable sometimes, but trust me, compared to what people in ancient times used, you're practically royalty. And honestly, after hearing how people really slept back then, you probably won't survive this story without at least wincing once. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, comment down below with your location and the local time where you are right now. I love seeing who's listening in from different corners of the world. It's kind of like our own little nighttime marketplace, but quieter and without the smell of goats. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself lying down in a small smoky hut thousands of years ago. The ground is packed dirt, uneven, with the faint smell of ash from the fire pit. There's no mattress. At best, you have a thin mat of straw or reeds, maybe stuffed inside an old cloth sack. If you were lucky, someone added a layer of wool or animal hide on top, and that's where you sleep. No memory foam, no pillows fluffed just right, just straw poking your back, bugs crawling around, and the occasional squeak of a mouse that wants to share your space. If you lived in a wealthier household, maybe you'd get a raised wooden bed. But don't get too excited. Early beds weren't about comfort. They were about avoiding the cold, damp floor, and the critters that liked to crawl across it at night. Some beds were literally made of wooden frames strung with ropes, which had to be tightened regularly. That's actually where the old phrase "sleep tight" comes from. If the rope sagged, you ended up sleeping in a lumpy hammock of discomfort. Now imagine the temperature. No thermostats, no heaters humming in the corner. In summer, you sweated under the buzzing of mosquitoes, maybe covering yourself with a thin sheet if you had one. In winter, you bundled up in every scrap of cloth and blanket available, still shivering while your breath turned into little clouds in the air. Families often slept huddled together for warmth. Kids piled up around parents like puppies, because insulation was just a dream. And let's talk about privacy. Spoiler, there wasn't any. For most of human history, people slept together in the same space. Families, servants, sometimes even animals. The idea of having your own private bedroom was a luxury reserved for nobles and kings. For everyone else, the night was a group activity, whether you liked it or not. That means you'd hear every cough, every snore, every midnight trip to the corner to relieve oneself. Good luck drifting into peaceful slumber with all that. It wasn't just about discomfort, though. Nighttime was genuinely dangerous. Without electricity, the world after sunset belonged to shadows. Fires and oil lamps gave a little glow, but they were expensive and, let's be honest, kind of terrifying. One wrong move and your whole hut could go up in flames. Many people simply let the darkness rule, going to bed soon after sunset and rising at dawn. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. Here's a fun fact to chew on. Historians believe that for centuries, people didn't even sleep in one long stretch the way we do today. Instead, they had what's called biphasic sleep, 2 sleeps, with a wakeful period in between. You'd fall asleep after dusk, wake up in the middle of the night for a couple hours, maybe to pray, think, or chat with family, and then drift back down until morning. Scholars still argue whether this was universal or just common in certain regions. But the point is, the idea of 8 hours straight, undisturbed, is a pretty modern invention. And then there's the quirky detail that still blows my mind. Pillows. In ancient Egypt, people didn't have fluffy cushions. They used carved wooden or stone headrests, basically a hard block under your skull. They believed it kept you cool and protected from bugs crawling into your mouth or ears while you slept. Practical? Maybe. Comfortable? Definitely not. Imagine trading your soft pillow tonight for a block of polished wood. Yeah, no thanks. But here's the thing. Despite all of this, people survived. They dreamed, they woke, they worked, and they kept on going. Which makes you wonder, do we actually need all the fancy comfort we've piled up around sleep today? Or is it just that we've gotten soft? Maybe both. As you lie there right now, with your cozy blanket and your carefully chosen pillow, take a moment to imagine the creak of rope beneath you, the smell of smoke in the air, the shuffle of someone else's body pressed up against yours in the dark. That was sleep for most of human history. And tonight, you and I are going to wander deeper into that world, step by step, until you drift off in the safety of your own modern bed, grateful you weren't born 1,000 years ago. So let's pull the covers up, close our eyes, and sink into the story of how humans have slept and somehow survived the strangest beds, the noisiest nights, and the weirdest rituals the past has to offer. You lie there, trying to picture what life would feel like when the rhythm of every single day was dictated not by alarms on your phone, but by the rising and setting of the sun. There are no glowing streetlights outside your window, no late-night glow of neon signs, and definitely no buzzing notifications to keep you awake past midnight. The moment the sun dips below the horizon, darkness isn't just a mood, it's an absolute fact. For ancient people, this meant that your sleep schedule was almost completely controlled by nature. The sun went down, and soon after, so did you. Not because you wanted to be healthy or aligned with your circadian rhythm, like modern influencers say, but because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do. Once candles burned out or lamps guttered, the only entertainment left was conversation, or, more commonly, just curling up and waiting for morning. Think about it. The average person in medieval Europe, or in an ancient village anywhere in the world, woke up with the first streak of light. Dawn wasn't something you avoided with blackout curtains. It was your alarm clock. Roosters crowed, animals stirred, markets prepared to open, and you rose because the world rose. If you tried to sleep in, you'd be wasting precious daylight, the only time when work could actually get done. And the length of that day wasn't always the same. In summer, you had long hours of brightness, which meant shorter nights and less sleep. In winter, nights stretched out endlessly, sometimes forcing people to go to bed absurdly early, just because the dark was overwhelming. Imagine it being pitch black by 5 in the evening and staying that way until nearly 7 the next morning. No wonder people developed strange sleep patterns to cope. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Before electricity, human activity was entirely tied to seasonal daylight. Scholars still argue whether this forced a universal bedtime, or whether different classes managed things differently. Farmers, for instance, had no choice. They were up before the sun to milk cows, and in bed shortly after sunset. Wealthier households, however, could afford candles and oil lamps, stretching their evenings longer, though at a cost. But here's a quirky little detail. In some places, people didn't even consider early sleeping a chore. They turned it into an event. Families would gather around the hearth, share food, swap stories, and sometimes sing before drifting into sleep together. For them, night wasn't boring, it was bonding. Compare that to now, when family time before bed often means scrolling in separate rooms, pretending we're connected through Wi-Fi. You can almost feel yourself slipping into that world. Picture sitting in a dim room, the glow of firelight painting shadows on the walls. Outside, the sounds of the village are fading, dogs barking faintly, a cart rolling away, then silence. No hum of traffic, no planes overhead. Just you, your family, and the knowledge that the sun is clocked out and so should you. It sounds peaceful, doesn't it? But let's not romanticize it too much. There was no one last episode to watch. But there was also no electricity to read by unless you wanted to risk burning your house down. Productivity dropped with the sun. And if you think you're unmotivated when the Wi-Fi goes out, imagine a whole lifestyle where every winter day ended in hours upon hours of darkness. Some historians even suggest this constant cycle of short days and long nights influenced the way communities built their cultures, filling those dark hours with prayer, myths, or even mischief. And here's another thing. Darkness wasn't safe. Shadows were feared for good reason. Thieves, wild animals, or simply the eerie quiet could make the night feel dangerous. So people chose to retreat into the one space they could control, their bed, however crude it was. For them, sleep wasn't just about rest, it was a survival strategy. As you let this picture sink in, you realize how dramatically different our relationship with time has become. Today, we bend nature to fit our schedules, stay up late, wake up early, cram sleep into whatever hours are left. Back then, humans bent to nature, surrendering themselves to the cycle of sun and dark. And maybe, just maybe, that rhythm made their lives slower, calmer, even if it was harder. They didn't chase productivity at midnight. They didn't brag about pulling an all-nighter. They simply accepted day is for work, night is for rest. So, as you lie under your blanket now, with the blue glow of a screen still flickering somewhere in your room, imagine for a moment surrendering to that ancient schedule. No fighting the night, no bargaining with time, just letting the sunset tell you it's enough. Sleep now. Now here's where things get really strange. Historians have uncovered that for much of history, humans didn't actually sleep in one long block the way we do today. Instead, They practiced something known as segmented sleep, here's how it worked. People would go to bed not long after sunset, say around 8 or 9 p.m. They'd sleep for a few hours and then they'd wake up. Not just toss and turn wake up, but actually get out of bed, light a lamp, and spend 1 to 3 hours awake in the middle of the night. This period had a name in old records, the watch, or sometimes the first waking. After this break, people would go back to bed for their second sleep until dawn. Imagine that for a second. You drift off as normal, sleep until maybe midnight or 1 a.m., and then it's like nature itself shakes you awake and says, "All right, you've had enough for now. Take a break." No guilt, no insomnia panic. This was just the expected rhythm. But what did people actually do in this mysterious middle of the night time? The answers are as fascinating as they are ordinary. Some prayed or read religious texts. Monks especially saw the watch as sacred. Farmers sometimes checked on animals or did small chores that didn't need daylight. Couples, well, historians say this was considered a very natural time for intimacy. Others simply sat, thought, or talked quietly with family by the dim firelight. One doctor from the 16th century even recommended this middle waking as a good time to conceive children because the body was more relaxed. Strange advice, but it shows how normal it was for people to expect that wakeful window. And here's the wild part. When scientists ran sleep experiments in total darkness, no electricity, no screens, modern people naturally slipped back into this exact same pattern. Sleep for 4 hours, wake up for 1 or 2, then fall back asleep for another. Or it seems this segmented sleep wasn't just cultural. It might actually be our natural biological rhythm. Now think about how differently that shapes life. Instead of struggling with insomnia, ancient people accepted it. Waking up at 2 a.m. wasn't a problem. It was just part of life. You'd sit, maybe whisper with your family, maybe step outside and look at the stars in a world far darker and quieter than ours. Then, when your mind settled, you'd slide back into your second sleep as if nothing unusual had happened. Doesn't that sound oddly peaceful? No checking your phone, no stressing about tomorrow's meeting. Just a slow rhythm. Sleep, wake, think, sleep again. Almost like life gave you 2 chances each night to reset your mind. This old pattern faded only in the last few centuries, when artificial light and strict work schedules forced humans into a compressed, single block of rest. But who knows? Maybe your body still remembers. The next time you wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason, instead of panicking, just imagine you're living the ancient rhythm of the first sleep and second sleep. Picture this, you wake up in the middle of the night during your first sleep. You stretch and you realize you're not lying on a memory foam mattress. In fact, depending on your social status, you might not be lying on a mattress at all. For the wealthy in ancient times, sleep could be a little luxurious, though not in the way we'd imagine today. In Roman villas, rich families had raised bed frames made of wood or bronze, with ropes strung across like a web. On top, they piled stuffed mattresses filled with straw, wool, or if you were really rich, goose feathers. Sounds comfy, right? Well, not always. Those ropes sagged, the straw poked, and the bugs inside the feathers didn't exactly respect your bedtime. Meanwhile, the poor often didn't have beds at all. They rolled out simple mats made of straw, reed, or plain wool blankets and laid them directly on the floor. Some slept on wooden boards, others just bare earth. Imagine curling up on the ground, hearing every shuffle of rats or creak of the house, and still having to convince yourself, "Yep, this is fine, good night." Families often slept together too. Not just a couple in one bed, but entire households. Parents, children, sometimes even servants or visiting relatives would crowd into the same sleeping space. Privacy, forget it. You were lucky if you got a corner to yourself. And if you had animals, goats, chickens, maybe even a donkey, they might be tucked in nearby too, especially in winter. The warmth mattered more than the smell. There's also the issue of bedding. The wealthy might have fancy linens dyed in colors that screamed status. But for most, bedding was a single, coarse blanket or a wool cloak, pulled tightly around your shoulders. One Roman poet mocked a man for having only one blanket. Turn it over in winter, for one side is warmer. In other words, you got whatever you got. Odd details keep showing up in history too. Some people slept on literal sacks of hay. Others, like in ancient Egypt, used headrests, carved from wood or stone, basically a mini block under your neck instead of a pillow. Scholars still argue whether that was comfortable or just an elaborate way to give yourself a stiff neck. And here's a quirky twist. Beds weren't just for sleeping. In many cultures, they doubled as couches, dining seats, and even workbenches. In Rome, people reclined on couches to eat dinner. In medieval homes, a bed was one of the most valuable objects, often passed down like an heirloom. It wasn't just where you slept. It was the centerpiece of the household. So, imagine it. You, lying there on a sagging rope bed or a crackly straw mat. Family pressed in on either side. The occasional chicken rustling in the corner. Not exactly luxury, but somehow, people got used to it. And maybe, just maybe, that closeness, the sound of breathing, the warmth of shared blankets, made it easier to drift off into the second sleep. Let's zoom in on the actual engineering of ancient beds. Because trust me, they were far stranger than anything you'll find at IKEA. First, let's start with the simplest kind, the wooden platform. Early beds were often just planks of wood raised a few inches off the ground. The idea wasn't comfort, it was protection. Sleeping directly on the floor meant inviting bugs, dirt and cold drafts to join you in bed. By lifting yourself even a little, you stayed safer. Then came the rope bed, a genuine game changer. Imagine a wooden frame, but instead of solid planks, you have ropes crisscrossed across the frame like a net. Over this, people placed a mattress or sack stuffed with straw, reeds, or wool. Comfortable? Sometimes, but ropes stretched and sagged quickly. You'd wake up in the morning with your body curved like a banana. The phrase sleep tight actually comes from this. Ropes had to be pulled taut and tightened regularly to keep the bed firm. In richer homes, rope beds were upgraded with headboards, carved designs, and sometimes canopies. Curtains weren't just decoration. They helped trap warmth and keep away drafts in freezing rooms. In fact, a curtained bed in medieval Europe was like having your own little heated tent inside the house. Now for the truly bizarre stone beds. Archaeologists have uncovered stone sleeping platforms in ancient Egyptian tombs and even in monasteries. Monks sometimes chose deliberately uncomfortable surfaces to remind themselves of humility. One monk supposedly slept on a stone slab with a log for a pillow every single night. Scholars still argue whether this was pure devotion or just really bad life choices. Speaking of pillows, some cultures didn't even believe in soft ones. In ancient China and Egypt, headrests were carved from wood, stone, or even porcelain. The logic was that keeping the head elevated would help with breathing, protect elaborate hairstyles, and ward off evil spirits. Comfort clearly wasn't the top priority. Imagine trying to fall asleep with your head balanced on a block. The Romans added a twist of luxury. They stuffed mattresses, not just with straw, but with wool, feathers, or even seaweed. Yes, seaweed. The idea was that dried sea plants were springy and cheap. Rich Romans might use goose down, while poorer folks stuck with hay that needed constant replacing as it grew moldy or infested with critters. Another quirky detail: Viking beds were often built directly into the walls of longhouses, almost like wooden cubbies. Whole families would tuck into these alcoves, separated by wooden boards. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was almost like a nest, protected from the cold wind that howled through the halls. So imagine yourself now you've got options: a saggy rope bed, a slab of stone, or a pile of straw on the floor. Each comes with its own quirks: creaky wood, itchy hay, or a stiff wooden pillow. Not exactly king-size luxury, but each one tells a story about survival, culture, and what people thought mattered most for a good night's rest. And maybe, lying there on your sagging ropes or your stone slab, you'd realize comfort wasn't the point. Sleep was about endurance, warmth, and sometimes even making a statement about your place in society. In ancient villages and medieval towns, families often lived in single-room homes. That meant cooking, eating, working, and yes, sleeping all happened in the same space. When night fell, everyone simply spread out where they could. Parents, children, grandparents, maybe a visiting cousin. It was a full house. And by full, I mean shoulder to shoulder, sometimes blanket to blanket. It wasn't just family either. In colder climates, animals were often brought indoors at night. Cows, goats, or chickens might share the same living space to provide body heat. Imagine trying to fall asleep while a chicken rustles at your feet, or a cow sighs loudly in the corner. Not exactly peaceful, but practical. Heat was life, and animals were like furry radiators. For travelers, things got even messier. Inns weren't like today's hotels with cozy rooms and clean sheets. Instead, they were giant rooms packed with strangers lying side by side on straw pallets. You might wake up with someone else's elbow in your face or fleas hopping across your blanket. One medieval traveler wrote that he spent the entire night scratching because the inn's bedding was alive with lice. Pleasant dreams, right? Even among the wealthy, privacy wasn't guaranteed. Nobles sometimes had separate bedchambers, but those rooms often doubled as offices, meeting spaces and social hubs. Servants might sleep on the floor nearby, ready to fetch things at odd hours, so even if you had a fancy curtained bed, you weren't exactly alone. This communal setup had its quirks. On the one hand, it meant warmth, safety, and companionship. Darkness was scary after all. No streetlights, no police, just endless night. Having others nearby was comforting. On the other hand, it also meant noise, snoring, coughing, whispering, babies crying, animals shuffling. Privacy? Forget about it. Secrets were nearly impossible when everyone could hear you rolling over. One quirky record from 17th century. England even describes friends or strangers. Bed sharing during travel to save money. It wasn't unusual for two people who barely knew each other to sleep in the same bed at an inn. In fact, some believed it was a chance to bond, swap stories, or share gossip before drifting off. Scholars still argue whether this was a purely practical arrangement, or whether it sometimes led to more. So picture yourself now, lying in a room packed with your entire family. Maybe a goat in the corner, a neighbor's kid kicking in his sleep, and the sound of rain leaking through the roof. Cozy? Maybe. Annoying? Definitely. But for ancient people, that was just normal. You weren't meant to sleep in silence and solitude. You were meant to sleep in company. Whether you liked it or not, woken up after your first sleep, and the room is pitch black. No glowing screens, no streetlights spilling through the window, just an almost suffocating darkness. If you wanted light, you had to make it, and that came with risks. Most households relied on candles or oil lamps. Candles were usually made of tallow, rendered animal fat, which gave off a weak flame and a terrible smell. Imagine trying to fall asleep with the scent of burning beef fat hanging in the air. If you were wealthy, you could afford beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter. But they were so expensive that even nobles saved them for special occasions. Oil lamps were another common option. These were small clay or bronze containers filled with olive oil, with a wick poking out. They gave a steadier flame than tallow candles, but they still smoked, sputtered, and dripped. And let's not forget, open flame inside a wooden house, full of straw bedding and wool blankets, was basically a disaster waiting to happen. Accidental fires were common. A single tipped-over candle could destroy an entire neighborhood of tightly packed homes. Medieval city records are filled with laws ordering people to put out lights before bed. Some towns even had curfews requiring fires to be extinguished at night. The very word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. And here's the strange part. Because light was expensive and dangerous, people actually lived with far more darkness than we can imagine. Once the sun went down, most people simply accepted that their world had shrunk. Nights were for sleep or for quiet. Dimly lit tasks during that middle of the night waking. There are quirky details too. Some households used rushlights, basically dried reeds dipped in animal fat. They burned quickly, unevenly, and made the room smell like scorched grass. Others lit pine splinters or torches, which smoked heavily and left soot stains across ceilings. Scholars still argue whether people preferred smoky rooms or just learned to live with constant coughing. The wealthy sometimes had elaborate metal lanterns with horn or glass panes to shield the flame from wind. These looked beautiful, but they were still risky. Servants were often tasked with staying awake to guard against fire, especially in large wooden houses or castles filled with flammable hangings. Imagine trying to sleep while knowing one careless spark could erase everything. So when you picture ancient nights, don't imagine cozy warm candlelight like in a period drama. Imagine more darkness than light, more smoke than glow, and the constant background fear that your little flame could turn into an inferno. And maybe that's why people leaned so heavily on the natural rhythms of dawn and dusk, because every hour of artificial light came at a cost, whether in coin, in comfort, or in safety. Now let's step outside the bedroom for a moment and think about how the seasons shaped the way people slept. Without electric lights, central heating, or air conditioning, sleep wasn't just a personal habit, it was ruled by the natural world. In summer, days were long and nights were short. Farmers, workers, and townsfolk often woke before sunrise to make use of the daylight. Sleep was shorter and lighter, with people sometimes napping during the day to make up for lost rest. Imagine lying in a stuffy wooden house, mosquitoes buzzing, the air thick with heat, and no fan to cool you down. A full night of deep sleep was rare, so the body adjusted by stealing little naps whenever possible. Winter told a completely different story. Nights stretched for 14 to 16 hours in some regions, plunging families into near hibernation. People went to bed shortly after dusk, rose for their first waking around midnight, and then returned to bed until dawn. Some historians believe that in medieval Europe, people sometimes spent as much as 12 to 14 hours in bed during the coldest months, not sleeping all the time, but drifting between dreams, wakefulness, prayer, and quiet conversation. Of course, winter brought its own challenges. Without insulation, houses were freezing. People bundled together for warmth, sometimes sleeping in their daytime clothes or piling on every blanket they owned. In poorer homes, families even brought animals inside to add heat. It wasn't unusual to fall asleep to the sound of cows shifting nearby or chickens rustling in the corner. There's also evidence that people used these long winter nights for reflection. In the quiet hours between first and second sleep, they prayed, told stories, or simply thought. It was a time of enforced slowness, when life narrowed to firelight and breath clouds in the cold air. Some scholars still argue whether this seasonal rhythm made people healthier or more lethargic, but it undeniably shaped the pace of life. And here's a quirky detail. In parts of northern Europe, where winters were especially harsh, people sometimes lined their beds with heated stones or filled metal pans with hot coals to warm the sheets. Convenient. Sure. Safe? Absolutely not. Fires from overturned braziers were a real danger. But when the alternative was shivering through a 16-hour night, people took the risk. So imagine it, you in summer, tossing restlessly on a straw mattress, sweat dripping, waiting for dawn to save you. Then picture winter, when the darkness outside stretches endlessly, and you bury yourself under layers of scratchy wool, listening to the wind howl and the faint cluck of a chicken beside you. Sleep wasn't one universal thing. It bent and shifted with the seasons, pulling humanity into rhythms that modern life has almost completely erased. Here's something easy to forget, because today most of us lock the door, maybe set an alarm, and then drift off without thinking about it. In the ancient and medieval world, nighttime was dangerous, really dangerous. Cities and towns weren't exactly safe havens after sunset, without strong police forces, with streets unlit and alleys twisting into blackness. The night was the perfect stage for thieves, drunkards, and worse. Sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about trusting that nothing bad would happen while you were vulnerable. That's why many communities had night watches. These were guards, sometimes official, sometimes just volunteers who patrolled the streets, ringing bells or calling out the hours to show they were awake. Imagine lying in bed and hearing a voice drift through the darkness. 3 o'clock and all is well. Comforting, sure, but also a reminder that without those voices, things might not be so well. Inside homes, people took their own precautions. In cities, doors were barred with heavy wooden beams, shutters were closed, and valuables were hidden. In villages, dogs often doubled as alarms, barking at the first sign of movement. Some households even rotated who stayed awake, taking turns to guard against intruders or fires. There's an eerie detail here. In medieval castles, guards would pace the walls all night, and their heavy boots on stone could be heard by those sleeping inside. Some nobles reportedly found it soothing, a constant reminder that someone was awake, watching. Others probably found it maddening, like trying to sleep next to a metronome. And of course, there was always the threat of fire. A single candle left burning or a cooking flame, not fully doused, could consume entire wooden neighborhoods. So families often kept buckets of water nearby, just in case. Some even slept lightly, ready to bolt upright at the smell of smoke. But danger wasn't always about crime or fire. Sometimes it was about the unknown. Without science to explain strange noises, people filled the dark with imagination, spirits, demons, witches. Sleep was vulnerable time when you couldn't defend yourself. In some places, charms or prayers were whispered before bed as protection, not just against thieves, but against the supernatural. Scholars still argue whether these fears made sleep more fragmented. Was biphasic sleep, that first and second sleep, partly a way to keep watch? Was the human body tuned not only to biology, but to the deep instinct that danger could strike at any moment? The evidence suggests it might be both. So picture yourself in that world. You lie down on your straw pallet, the room crowded with family and animals, and you listen. Outside, the faint clang of a guard's bell echoes in the street. A dog barks in the distance. You wrap your blanket tighter, aware that the darkness is thick, endless, and full of things you hope never find their way to your door. Sleep comes, but it's never quite without caution. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine drifting off in a smoky, candlelit room after a long day of work. You wake up in the middle of the night with a vivid dream still echoing in your head. In the modern world, you might shrug it off or Google what it means. But for much of history, dreams weren't random. They were messages. Ancient cultures often believed that dreams were direct lines to the divine. In Mesopotamia, priests recorded dreams on clay tablets, interpreting them as prophecies. In ancient Egypt, people slept in temples hoping that the gods would visit them in dreams to offer cures or guidance. Greek and Roman societies went even further. They had professional dream interpreters who analyzed your visions to predict the future. Imagine paying someone to tell you why you dreamed about losing your sandals. Medieval Europe carried those traditions forward, but with a Christian twist. Dreams were often seen as either divine visions from God or temptations from the devil. A peaceful dream of angels could be a blessing. A nightmare of demons, proof that evil forces were testing you. There are even records of monks confessing bad dreams as if they were sins, worried that their subconscious might reveal weakness. Some details are surprisingly quirky. A Roman writer once claimed that dreaming of lettuce meant prosperity, while dreaming of being struck by lightning could mean good luck, unless it meant death. Interpretations were inconsistent, but people clung to them. Scholars still argue whether dreams were truly considered universal truths or just comforting bedtime stories that gave meaning to the chaos of life. For ordinary people, dreams might also serve as warnings. If you dreamed of a loved one in danger, you might pray harder the next day or avoid certain places. A dream of poor harvests could lead to actual preparations, as if your subconscious was already planning for famine. In a world without weather apps or reliable science, dreams became a kind of mystical survival tool. And then there's the intimacy of it. Imagine families crowded into one room, waking during that first sleep period and quietly sharing their dreams in the dark. Maybe a child whispers about seeing a strange animal in their dream, and the parents nod, taking it seriously. Maybe someone laughs about dreaming of too much bread, while another shivers from a nightmare of spirits outside. Dreams weren't just private, they were communal stories, shaping the way people saw the night. Today we tend to treat dreams as curiosities or random brain static. But for ancient sleepers, they were woven into daily life, faith, and even politics. Emperors claimed their dreams gave them divine authority. Ordinary farmers feared their nightmares foretold disaster. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a nightly negotiation with unseen forces, one that could guide, warn, or terrify. So, as you imagine yourself lying there on a straw mat or sagging rope bed, the dream you just had doesn't fade away. It lingers, pulling you into debates about destiny, the gods, and what tomorrow might bring. And in that world, you wouldn't dare dismiss it. When we think about bedtime accessories today, we imagine soft pillows, cozy blankets, or maybe a glass of warm milk. But in the past, the things people used to help them sleep were far stranger and sometimes uncomfortable. Let's start with pillows. In ancient Egypt and China, the word pillow didn't mean something soft and fluffy. Instead, it often meant a carved block of wood, stone, or porcelain designed to keep your head elevated. Egyptians believed these hard supports protected sleepers from evil spirits, while the Chinese thought porcelain pillows could cool the mind and encourage good dreams. It's hard to imagine drifting off on a block of stone, but for them, it was both practical and spiritual. In medieval Europe, pillows were more familiar to us, stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, but not everyone used them. For centuries, pillows were considered a luxury, something fit for women or the wealthy, but unnecessary or even unmanly for ordinary men. Some nobles had elaborate embroidered pillows, while peasants made do with sacks of hay. The quality of your pillow said a lot about your status. Beyond pillows, there were charms and amulets. Across cultures, people kept protective items near the bed to ward off nightmares, illness, or spirits. A child might sleep with a small carved figure, a sprig of garlic, or a religious medal tied around the neck. In parts of Europe, iron objects were placed under the bed to repel evil. The line between medicine, magic, and superstition was often blurred, especially at night when fears were strongest. Then there were the herbs and potions. Lavender, chamomile, poppy, and even lettuce were used to induce drowsiness. Ancient Romans sometimes placed fresh herbs under their pillows, believing the aroma could calm the mind. In medieval households, people brewed sleeping potions from mixtures of wine, honey, and herbs. Some were harmless. Others were dangerously strong, containing opium or henbane. A sip might send you into a gentle slumber, or a frightening hallucinatory state. And let's not forget about bed warmers. In cold climates, sleeping wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Before central heating, people filled metal pans with hot coals, slid them between the sheets, and hoped the bed would warm before they climbed in. It worked, if you didn't accidentally scorch the sheets or inhale too much smoke. For children, strange bedtime rituals were common. Parents hung protective charms above cradles, whispered prayers, or even left offerings to local spirits. In some places, sharp tools like scissors or knives were placed near a child's bed, not to harm them, but to scare away evil. Imagine trying to sleep as a child, knowing your parents had to put weapons under your bed to keep you safe. And finally, there were the personal quirks. Some people slept with their boots on to be ready for emergencies. Others wrapped their heads in cloth to keep away drafts. In parts of Asia, it wasn't unusual to use mosquito nets, not just to block insects, but because nets were thought to create a safe, enclosed sleeping space that spirits couldn't penetrate. All of these accessories remind us that sleep was never just a biological need. It was a vulnerable state, a moment when the body rested but the mind and the imagination was exposed. Every object, from a carved pillow to a sprig of lavender, carried meaning. People weren't just chasing comfort. They were protecting themselves, guarding their souls, and preparing for the mysterious journey of the night. You settle in for sleep, but the night is anything but silent. In the ancient world, animals were everywhere. Inside homes, outside windows in the streets, or on rooftops, and their noises shaped the way people slept. Start with the rooster. Today we think of roosters as morning alarms, but in villages and cities alike, they crowed throughout the night. Their calls often marked the passage of time in place of clocks. Roman soldiers even used the crowing of cocks to divide the night into watches. Imagine lying awake, trying to drift off, and being interrupted at 2 a.m. by a rooster announcing dawn, 4 hours too early. Dogs were another constant presence. In ancient cities, stray dogs roamed the streets, barking at intruders, shadows, or simply one another. A barking dog outside your window could make sleep frustratingly difficult, just as it does today. But dogs also served as guardians, and their sounds were reassuring to some. If your dog barked, it meant someone or something was near, and that you weren't alone in the dark. Then there were the owls and nightbirds. Their calls could be eerie, and many cultures linked them with death, magic, or bad omens. In Rome, owls were believed to foretell disaster. In medieval Europe, their cries were often associated with witches. Hearing one in the middle of the night was enough to send a chill through even the bravest sleeper. Scholars still argue whether these associations were purely symbolic or if they reflected real fears rooted in people's daily lives. Insects also made their presence known. Without glass windows or effective screens, homes were filled with buzzing mosquitoes, flies, and crickets. In warm climates, the constant hum of insects became a kind of background music for sleep. But it wasn't soothing for everyone. Mosquitoes carried disease, and their bites were more than just irritating. People often draped nets, burned herbs, or smeared oils on their skin to keep them away. Larger animals contributed too. In rural communities, cows, goats, or sheep might be kept indoors at night for safety. Their shifting hooves, snorts, and occasional bleats would echo through the same rooms where people tried to rest. In colder regions, it was common to let animals share living spaces to add warmth, meaning your lullaby might be the rhythmic chewing of a cow. And of course, the human-made sounds of the night blended with animal noises. Street vendors packing up late, travelers clattering down cobblestones, or guards calling out the hours all created a restless soundscape. For some, this was normal, part of the texture of urban life. For others, it was maddening, a reminder that the world never truly slept. What's striking is that people didn't necessarily expect silence the way we do now. The night was alive, full of voices, wings, and howls. For them, sleep was something you snatched between disturbances, a fragile balance between rest and awareness. Some even found comfort in the noise, like a reminder that life continued around them. Others prayed, chanted, or stuffed wool in their ears to drown it out. So as you drift off now, imagine yourself in a wooden bed in a medieval town, trying to ignore the rooster that just crowed too early, the barking dog outside the door, and the owl's haunting call. Sleep, for our ancestors, wasn't a matter of shutting out the world. It was learning to coexist with its endless night sounds. You lie down, ready to rest. But in the ancient and medieval imagination, sleep wasn't just rest. It was dangerous. It was mysterious, and it was surrounded by countless superstitions. Start with the most universal fear: nightmares. To us, nightmares are just bad dreams. But to people in the past, they were signs of something sinister. Many believed nightmares were caused by evil spirits, pressing down on the chest of a sleeper, suffocating them. This image shows up in European folklore as the night hag or Mara, an invisible creature sitting on your body while you sleep. Even today, the phrase nightmare carries that echo. Imagine waking up in the dark, your chest heavy, unable to move, an experience modern science calls sleep paralysis. But back then, it was a demon visiting your bed. In other places, dreams themselves were taken seriously. Ancient Egyptians kept dream books, guides for interpreting visions that appeared while sleeping. A dream of clear water might mean good fortune, while one of a snake might mean betrayal. The boundary between reality and dream wasn't sharp. It was a channel for messages from gods or ancestors. People often slept in temples hoping to receive healing dreams, a practice known as dream incubation. But sleep wasn't just about dreams, it was also about spirits. Many households left protective charms by the bed. In parts of Europe, iron scissors or knives were placed under pillows to cut away evil. In the Middle East, blue beads or eye-shaped charms were thought to ward off bad luck while sleeping. Parents whispered prayers over their children to shield them from wandering spirits. Then there were taboos about how you positioned yourself. In China, it was considered unlucky to sleep with your head facing north, because that was the orientation of graves. In parts of Europe, sleeping with your feet pointed toward the door was avoided, because that was how corpses were carried out. To fall asleep in the wrong position was to invite misfortune, or even death. The night also blurred the line between medicine and magic. If someone couldn't sleep, families didn't just blame stress or diet. They thought of curses, witches, or imbalanced humors. Remedies often mixed herbs with ritual. You might drink a potion of chamomile or lettuce juice, but you might also be told to recite a charm or hang a saint's relic by your bedside. Scholars still argue whether these practices were more about genuine belief or simply tradition passed down through generations. Children were especially vulnerable in these beliefs. Parents tied protective amulets around babies' necks, placed garlic near their cribs, or sprinkled salt around the bed to keep spirits away. Some even avoided speaking a child's name at night, fearing it might attract unwanted attention. For adults, too, silence was important. Midnight was a time of power, when spells or prayers carried extra weight. Perhaps strangest of all, some people believed that the soul left the body while sleeping. Dreams were the soul's adventures beyond the flesh, wandering through other worlds. That made waking someone suddenly dangerous. You risked snapping the tether between soul and body. It wasn't just rude to shake someone awake. It could be deadly. So as you pull your blanket tighter, think about the weight of these fears. Every creak of the house, every odd dream, every shadow in the corner could mean more than it seemed. For our ancestors, sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was a nightly negotiation with the unseen, a reminder that the world of dreams and spirits was always just one breath away. When you picture a bed today, it's something universal. Almost everyone has one. But in the past, your bed wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a social signal, a stage on which wealth, power, and even morality were displayed. For the poorest families, a bed was little more than a pile of straw, hay, or reeds. Sometimes it wasn't even raised off the ground. In crowded homes, everyone might sleep together in one corner, covered with rough woolen blankets, if they had blankets at all. Straw beds had to be replaced often, since they quickly became itchy, dirty, and full of pests. To a traveler or noble, such bedding would look shockingly uncomfortable, but for the majority, this was normal. Move up the ladder and you'd find simple wooden frames. A peasant who had a bit of money might build a crude bed with ropes strung across a frame and a sack of straw or feathers on top. The phrase "sleep tight" actually comes from this setup. Ropes had to be tightened regularly to keep the bed firm. It wasn't luxury, but it was a step above lying on the floor. For the wealthy, beds became statements of taste and status. In medieval Europe, noble families slept in massive wooden beds with carved headboards, painted panels, and heavy curtains. These curtains weren't just decorative. They provided privacy and warmth in drafty stone castles. A bed in a noble hall could weigh hundreds of pounds and last for generations. Owning one meant you weren't just rich, you had heritage. Kings and queens, of course, took it further. Royal beds were often gilded, embroidered, and draped in silks. But here's the twist. These beds weren't always private. In some courts, the monarch's bedchamber doubled as a political stage. Courtiers were invited to witness the king or queen rising from bed, a ritual called the lever, or even preparing for sleep. The bed itself became a throne, symbolizing authority, intimacy, and power. Sleeping was transformed into a performance. Beds also told stories about marriage and family. In many traditions, a marriage bed was the centerpiece of a household. It was blessed, celebrated, and sometimes even paraded in public as proof of the new union. Wealthy families might spend fortunes on a bridal bed, knowing it would serve as the foundation for both their lineage and their social reputation. Even the humble guest bed carried meaning. Offering a guest a soft, well-prepared bed signaled hospitality and honor. Failing to do so marked you as poor, or worse, rude. Beds weren't just personal, they were part of the social fabric, shaping how people were judged. And yet, despite the extravagance at the top, most people lived closer to the bottom of that spectrum. Their beds were sacks of straw or mats laid on wooden floors. The gap between peasant and noble was visible every night in how they slept. To rest on silk cushions under velvet canopies wasn't simply about comfort. It was about showing the world that you mattered, that you belonged to the ruling class. So the next time you climb into your mattress and pull up your blanket, think about the silent message it sends. For us, beds are private spaces. For our ancestors, they were loud declarations about wealth, family, power, and the place you held in society. Elusive for some of the most powerful and influential people. Their struggles, and sometimes their strange habits, show how universal the challenge of rest really is. Take Alexander the Great. Ancient writers claim he often slept little, pacing through his camp at night, restless and unable to turn off his mind. Some say he used this wakefulness to plan military campaigns, turning sleepless hours into strategies that conquered empires. Others suggest he feared assassination and could never fully relax. Whether genius or paranoia, his sleeplessness shaped his legend. Then there's Julius Caesar. Known for his energy, he supposedly could nap anywhere, anytime. Friends and enemies alike remarked on how he would steal moments of rest in the middle of political chaos, or even on a military march. For Caesar, sleep wasn't a nightly ritual. It was a resource to be taken in fragments, fueling his relentless pace. Scholars still argue whether this was true resilience or a sign of hidden exhaustion. Philosophers, too, had their nighttime quirks. Aristotle believed sleep was essential for balance, yet he was fascinated by dreams and their connection to the soul. Descartes, centuries later, credited a series of strange dreams during a single night with inspiring his entire philosophical system. For thinkers like these, sleeplessness wasn't always a curse, it was sometimes the gateway to revelation. In medieval times, religious figures embraced wakefulness as a form of devotion. Monks and nuns practiced segmented sleep, waking for prayers at midnight and returning to bed only after chanting in dark chapels. For them, sleep was a spiritual struggle, a way to discipline the body and strengthen the soul. Staying awake was proof of faith. Even writers were shaped by their insomnia. Charles Dickens famously wandered the streets of London at night, unable to rest. He claimed the city's noises and shadows gave him inspiration, but his insomnia also haunted him. Franz Kafka suffered similarly, describing nights filled with restless anxiety that spilled directly into his surreal stories. For both, sleeplessness was not just personal, it was creative fuel. And then there's Napoleon Bonaparte. He bragged about thriving on only a few hours of sleep each night, using the rest of his time to command armies and govern France. Yet his personal letters reveal moments of exhaustion, where his body seemed to betray him. Perhaps he, too, discovered that defying the natural need for rest eventually comes with a cost. Even modern figures are remembered for their unusual sleep habits. Nikola Tesla claimed he needed only 2 hours of sleep a night, though he later admitted to nervous breakdowns caused by his relentless schedule. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, swore by long afternoon naps, claiming they gave him 2 days in one. His nighttime insomnia didn't stop him from leading Britain through war, but it did leave him pacing Downing Street at odd hours. What connects all these stories is the tension between human limits and human ambition. Sleep is universal, but these figures treated it as negotiable, something to be bent, trimmed, or transformed. Some found inspiration in wakefulness, others suffered from it, but all remind us that even the most powerful are not free from the mysteries of the night. So as you listen now, drifting closer to rest, remember, Sleeplessness is not just your struggle. It has walked alongside kings, philosophers, generals, and poets. In the stillness of the night, they too wrestled with thoughts that refused to fade, eyes that refused to close, and dreams that hovered just out of reach. Before you drifted into sleep in the past, there was always a ritual, a sequence of actions, some practical, some deeply symbolic, that prepared the body and the mind for the vulnerability of the night. Start with the most basic, washing. In medieval Europe, people didn't bathe as often as we do now, but a quick wash of the hands, face, and feet before bed was common. The feet especially mattered, since they collected dust and mud from long days of walking. In some cultures, washing was also spiritual. In the Islamic world, evening ablutions were tied to prayer, combining cleanliness with religious devotion. For many, going to sleep unwashed felt like tempting bad luck. Then came food and drink. Ancient Romans sometimes ate a light snack before bed, believing a full stomach could produce bad dreams. Medieval doctors advised against heavy meals at night for the same reason. Undigested food, they claimed, created restless visions. Still, many people sipped warm drinks, from spiced wine to herbal teas, hoping the heat would relax them. A cup of poppy-infused milk, for example, was thought to calm the nerves and coax sleep. After eating came prayer. Across cultures, prayers or chants were whispered in the dark. In Christian households, families recited evening prayers together. In Jewish tradition, the Shema was said before bed. In Hindu households, bedtime rituals might include offerings of flowers or reciting mantras. The idea was the same: to guard the soul during its nighttime journey and keep evil at bay. But not all rituals were solemn. Some were downright odd. In parts of Europe, people knocked on wood or spat lightly on the floor before lying down, small acts meant to confuse or repel spirits. In China, certain families set out bowls of rice or water to distract wandering ghosts. Even small gestures mattered because night was believed to attract unseen visitors. And then there was the bed preparation itself. For peasants, this might mean shaking straw, mattresses to chase away vermin and smoothing out itchy lumps. For nobles, it was far more elaborate. Servants warmed sheets with bed warmers, tucked in embroidered linens, and sometimes even perfumed the room with herbs. The ritual of turning down a noble's bed could involve multiple people, making sleep itself feel like a royal ceremony. Families also practiced segmented routines. Since first sleep and second sleep were common, people often went to bed early, woke at midnight for prayers or quiet conversation, and then returned to rest until dawn. Midnight hours were sometimes considered a gift, private time to read, talk, or even visit neighbors before the world slept again. It was both practical and mystical, a space between day and night. Children, too, had their own rituals. Mothers told bedtime stories, sang lullabies, or rocked cradles, blending comfort with protection. Some families left lamps burning for little ones, afraid the darkness might invite harm. Others believed absolute darkness was safer, since light could attract wandering spirits. Even sleeping arrangements had ritual meaning. In some places, elders always slept closest to the door, ready to face intruders, while children were tucked deepest into the bed. The order reinforced respect, responsibility, and hierarchy. Bedtime wasn't just individual, it was social. So before sleep, every action, washing, praying, eating, arranging, was a step in a delicate dance between safety and surrender. People didn't see sleep as automatic. They had to prepare for it, guard it, and shape it, night after night. In the past, sleep was rarely a single uninterrupted stretch. Instead, many people slept in shifts, a practice shaped by danger, work schedules, and household logistics. Imagine a family of 6 in a one-room home with a fire, animals, and no locks on the door. Continuous sleep was a luxury. They needed rotation, vigilance, and compromise. Take soldiers, for example. Night watches were mandatory in forts, camps, and city walls. A group would sleep while another stayed awake. Pacing battlements or patrolling streets, sleep became a resource to be rationed. Naps were stolen in intervals and exhaustion was normal. Historians argue that this method kept vigilance, high but fragmented natural sleep patterns, creating a society accustomed to biphasic or even polyphasic rest. In civilian life, crowded homes forced a similar system. Beds were shared. People slept on mats, pallets, or straw sacks. Families rotated sleeping positions, sometimes alternating between warm inner spots and cooler edges. In some cultures, elder family members rested in the center, while younger ones took the edges near doors, blending warmth with protection. Children often slept closest to fire pits to stay warm, but also to benefit from adult oversight. The first sleep and second sleep phenomenon was a natural example of shift sleeping. After the first few hours of deep slumber, people would awaken around midnight. This period wasn't wasted. It was used for prayer, reflection, chores, or quiet conversation. Then they would return to bed for a second sleep before dawn. Scholars still debate whether this rhythm was universal or limited to certain European regions, but diaries, legal records, and literature strongly suggest it was common. Interestingly, sleep shifts weren't always rigid. Some people adapted to seasonal changes, sleeping longer during winter nights and shorter in summer. Farmers might take naps in the fields during long days, supplementing nighttime rest. In towns, merchants might rest in brief intervals between closing stalls and nighttime household duties. Sleep became flexible, a tool to match life's demands rather than a fixed schedule. There were also quirky accommodations. Wealthy households sometimes hired bedguards or attendants, whose sole purpose was to wake residents at the right times, either for prayers or for safety. In extreme cases, people slept with bells or strings attached to beds, so that movement or attempts at theft would immediately alert the household. It wasn't just sleep, it was strategic, a balance between rest and awareness. Even in hospitals, inns, and monasteries, shift sleeping persisted. Monks rotated for midnight prayers. Travelers shared beds in inns, and caregivers attended the sick in staggered shifts. Sleep was communal, purposeful, and sometimes interrupted, but it was still considered restorative. For our ancestors, sleeping in shifts wasn't a choice, it was necessary. It reinforced social order, ensured survival, and integrated work, prayer, and vigilance into the rhythm of life. By comparison, modern continuous sleep feels luxurious, almost indulgent. Our ancestors knew that sleep was precious, and they organized their nights meticulously to maximize it. Even if it meant fragmenting it, sleep in the past wasn't just dictated by nature, danger, or work. It was also heavily influenced by culture and ritual. Festivals, religious observances, and fasting periods often disrupted normal sleep patterns, creating nights that were lively, restless, or even exhausting. Take medieval festivals, for example. These weren't quiet affairs. Streets filled with music, dancing, and shouting. In towns, people might sleep lightly or not at all, attending celebrations that lasted until dawn. Drummers, minstrels, and town criers provided the soundtrack. And even if you tried to rest, the soundscape ensured that sleep was fragmented. Scholars still argue whether such nights were restorative, stressful, or simply part of cultural conditioning. But diaries from the period suggest people adjusted over time, treating these events as necessary exceptions. Fasting periods created their own nighttime rhythms. Religious fasts sometimes required individuals to abstain from food and drink after sunset. This could lead to hunger-induced wakefulness in the middle of the night. Some people supplemented their fasts with prayer, chants, or meditation, turning physical discomfort into spiritual vigilance. In some monastic traditions, night vigils were combined with fasting, so monks would rise for prayer and reflection, enduring hunger as a form of devotion. Seasonal festivals also disrupted sleep. Harvest celebrations in rural Europe, Holi and Diwali in India, or Chinese New Year traditions often involved late-night preparation, ritual, and family gatherings. Sleep became flexible. Some would nap in the afternoon to compensate, while others simply embraced exhaustion as part of the communal experience. Oddly, this irregular sleep might have actually improved social cohesion. Shared wakefulness reinforced bonds, created shared memories, and sometimes even contributed to collective storytelling or song-making that lasted until the early morning. Even funerary and mourning practices interfered with rest. In many cultures, family members were expected to stay awake beside the deceased, guarding the body and performing rituals. Sleep was deferred, sometimes for hours or even days, turning grief into both emotional and physical vigilance. Again, sleep wasn't just a biological need, it was a duty intertwined with cultural norms. Interestingly, some festivals combined ritual fasting and nighttime activity in ways that we might find exhausting today. In Japan, Matsuri celebrations involved dancing, music, and fireworks that kept entire towns awake. In Europe, carnival nights before Lent were deliberately indulgent, designed to consume energy before a period of fasting. Scholars still debate whether such cultural interventions were purely symbolic or had tangible impacts on sleep cycles and health. But it's clear they forced adaptation. Animals often played a role in these nights too. Fireworks, drums, or torches disturbed livestock, whose noises in turn disturbed human sleep. In villages, dogs barked incessantly, and barn animals shifted, adding to the cacophony. Urban citizens experienced similar disruptions from market animals, street performers, and city crowds. So as you imagine lying down in these historical settings, know that sleep wasn't guaranteed. Nights were dynamic, sometimes dangerous, sometimes joyous, always socially meaningful. Whether through festivals, fasts, or ritual duties, humans adapted, adjusting schedules, embracing fragmented rest, and making sleep a reflection of the life they lived.